Finance Minister Tito Mboweni said to present the medium-term budget policy statement on Wednesday. It's a tense time for the minister amid calls from political parties that he stick to his guns and cut spending in the wake of COVID-19. It's going to be a tough balancing act, according to many people, with rising unemployment and numerous sectors asking for government intervention. Let's check in on what to expect with Duma Gqubule, the founding director of the Center for Economic Development and Transformation. He's joining us now via Zoom in Johannesburg for a sense of what to expect. Duma, thanks very much for your time. Welcome to the AM report. So much to consider, such little time. What do you imagine is the minister's biggest headache as we speak?
Ayanda, the biggest headache in our country right now is that we're reeling from the shock of a once-in-a-century pandemic. Our GDP will collapse by 10%, as I've been saying for the past 6 months. And we're going to see a massive rise in unemployment, poverty and inequality. This is a crisis like no other, and it demands a response like no other. And I just have to say something in this clip before. You're saying that we need to cut spending. Now, what I want to say is that, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, the Nigerian author, said in a different context that there's a danger of a single narrative. Yeah. Now, there's a danger of a single narrative in South Africa right now, is that there is only one narrative, one thing that you see on the airwaves. It's about this austerity, structural reforms, cutting government spending, which makes no sense whatsoever in the context of a recession. There is no way of getting out of this crisis without injecting new money into the economy. And I just want to say the budget will take its cue from the President's recovery plan. Now, I've looked through this recovery plan. I've done a forensic on it, and I can tell all the listeners on Newzroom that this recovery plan of the President doesn't add a cent to government's inadequate response to this once-in-a-century pandemic. In economic terms, the President said nothing. And I have to wonder why the President brought the whole nation to watch him in Parliament when he had nothing to say on the economic aspects of this recovery. And the President, in the response to the debate in Parliament, he actually conceded that. And he says, some people may think that we're just repackaging old projects, which is what is happening. And then he says, but we have a new resolve and a new determination. Now, that is totally inadequate for the challenge that we're facing as a country. We have to get together and have a proper recovery plan for this economy.
Right. Okay, so hypothetically speaking, let's say Tito Mboweni does agree with you that there needs to be increased spending to respond to the economic fallout of COVID-19. The question becomes then spending on what? Because there is a pending bailout, if you like, for SAA. Government has already agreed to give the struggling SOE money for its business rescue plan. But there's also questions around whether or not that money shouldn't go to things like health, as well as other efforts that are linked to, solving the economic crisis, for instance. So yes, spending, but spending on what?
Okay, first of all, let me tell you what's likely to happen. I was looking through the numbers over the weekend, and I was actually horrified that what National Treasury is saying is that in the midst of the worst pandemic in a century, they're going to cut government spending this year. And over the next 3 years, there will be deep cuts in non-interest expenditure. So this will exacerbate the crisis, prolong the depression, and plunge our country into its worst and post-apartheid economic crisis. Now, what we should be doing, and hundreds of economists have sent letters to the President to say there is an alternative to this. You mustn't just... The problem is that the President and all the mainstream economists, they think the national budget operates like a household. But the national budget does not operate like a household because the household can't print the currency, the pocket money they can give children. So what happens in this, we've got the central bank behind us, we've got many... So what I'm saying we should do as a country, number one, we have to provide humanitarian relief to millions of people who are suffering from this pandemic. And many of us are calling for a basic income grant. And we saw the extension of the COVID grant, the inadequate 350 COVID grant for 3 months. I believe we should have immediate discussions around a basic income grant. Most civil society people are talking at about 1,227 rands a month. That's number one. Number two, we should have obviously what the President is talking about, an infrastructure plan. But you can't have an infrastructure plan if the government is prepared to contribute nothing towards it. And the government is not. The main reason for the collapse of infrastructure for the past 5 years has been government. So unless government shows us how they're going to reverse the collapse of their infrastructure spending. So I just want to make one last point, is that You know, when the government spends, the IMF's fiscal monitor came out last week. They said when the government spends R1 on infrastructure, they get 2.7 rands back. So that is why the national budget is different from a household budget, because if you spend money on a basic income grant and you spend money on infrastructure, the government gets the money back. Just picture the scenario where we have this basic income grant and people go and they spend it in their poor communities in Diepsloot and Soweto and Tembisa, and there's immediate VAT. It supports the economy and it results in it supports the economy and the government gets tax revenue back.
Right. The minister speaking at a Stellenbosch webinar a few days, if not weeks ago, sounding the alarm that the country should brace for a fiscal crisis in about 4 years' time. What needs to change to avoid that from happening?
Okay, so the difference, the finance minister talked about Argentina. There's a big difference between South Africa and Argentina. 90% of our debt is domestic. Argentina, the majority of its debt is foreign. So now in finance and economics, they say the original sin is borrowing in foreign currency. And we have a unique privilege amongst developing countries that most of our debt is domestic. So we can't get into the situation that Argentina is. Now let me address this issue of the debt crisis. The latest stats from the IMF show that we had at the end of December 62.2% debt to GDP ratio. There is no universe in which that is a high number, and many countries, Angola, Mozambique, are way above us in our neighborhood, and Brazil, India, many of Egypt are way higher than us. And so what I'm trying to say is that what's going to happen according to the IMF is that every country in the world will suffer the exact same shock as us. Every country in the world will have an increase in the debt to GDP ratio. The world average is 83% and will increase to 100%. So ours will increase by exactly the same percentage point to 78%. And I should mention a point that there is no tipping point at which a rise in debt to GDP ratio results in a collapse of the economy. That is not true. So what we should be doing is that the central bank must come in and support the government, as has happened in 18 emerging markets since the start of this crisis, like Indonesia, Brazil, and so forth. What the central bank is to enter and buy more government debt on the secondary market to bring the cost of capital down for the government. Secondly, they must buy more debt on the primary market where new debt issues are made. And the central bank must support the government's borrowing to address this pandemic. So we can't say we are broke when we have a central bank that can support the government in terms of the response that it wants.
Interesting insights indeed. The minister's job certainly not enviable at this time. Thanks very much for coming through to the AM Report, giving us your take on what to expect. Duma Gqubule is the founding director of the Center for Economic Development and Transformation, giving us an idea of what we should be worried about as we count down to the midterm budget policy statement that's likely to be delivered by the minister come Wednesday.